Thank you for joining us today at the Customs Colloquium, Thursday Colloquium series. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Dave Guston from ASU, Arizona State University. And this talk is part of one of our themes at the center, which is around regulatory science, questions of the knowledge that's used, deployed to underwrite and back up public policy. And this is a direction that we're moving in the center, and this talk is part of a series of talks in this arena. Dave is a professor of political science at ASU and a co-director of the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes. He and Arizona State are leaders in research and education in science and technology policy. And this experiment, what they see as an experiment in understanding the science-society interface and training students in new ways around that interface. CSPO, or the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, is kind of an umbrella network of projects in these areas. They have an office in Washington, D.C., and one of their major constitutive initiatives is a center on nanotechnology in society. And this is a NSF-funded center that Dave is the PI for and runs. And it's a very large center, as I understand it. Maybe the biggest center for the social aspects of nanotechnology in the world. So it's an important center that's exploring, as a theme again, can social scientists and the public be involved at an earlier stage in the development of a technology? So it's often a problem posed by STS that too often in the world we think about technology and then ethics and values sort of on the other side. STS folks, of course, point out that values and ethics shape technology through the whole process anyway, but it's not portrayed that way. I take the intervention at ASU and a lot of Dave's work on new kinds of technology assessment in real time to be that we should be engaging self-consciously in a shaping effort at an earlier stage of technology development so that technology might conform to our articulated values in a more explicit way. Dave's research, he's been prolific and written a book called Between Politics and Science, Assuring the Integrity and Productivity of Research, that was out of Cambridge University Press, and was awarded the Don K. Price Prize in the American Political Science Association for Best Book in Science and Technology Policy. That's a prestigious prize in the field. He's edited and co-written or co-edited a number of other books and a series on nanotechnology, as well as being a recent founding editor of a journal called Journal of Responsible Innovation. And if he didn't pin you down already, he'll probably tell you that you should submit work to the journal. But it's already taken off, and they're getting tons of submissions, and it's already developed a good reputation. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Dave Guston.
Thank you. Okay. This is going to go there. This goes someplace else. Thank you very much, David. That was a generous introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. This is one of the times of the year when what goes on in Arizona climatologically corresponds roughly with what goes on here. So I haven't noticed too much of a transition, but I now know I heard the ringing from the tower just at 4 o'clock sharp, which is probably why you start the talks at 4:10. So nobody knows that you're actually late if you're going on at 4:10. So as David described in the introduction, I direct this thing called the Center for Nanotechnology and Society at ASU, and what I'd like to do in the time that I've got is describe to you its sort of central intellectual vision, which is this thing that we call anticipatory governance, and how it relates to a couple of other kinds of thoughts in the literature, some of the reception that it's got in the literature, and then more specifically some of the ways that we derive a research agenda coming out of this vision. There we go. Okay, so the center, as David described, is large. We get a little bit more than $1 million a year from the U.S. National Science Foundation. We were created in October of 2005. We had a 5-year run. We competed for renewal. We got a little bit more money for the second 5 years, and so now we're sort of very far on the downhill side of the slope. We will be finishing up our new money in August. We'll have a year of a no-cost extension, and then we may simply evaporate. We can talk about that a little bit at the end, but these are the people who, in addition to me, are responsible for a lot of the work that's going on. The PIs on top. Next to me there is Clark Miller, also at ASU, Dietram Scheufele at University of Wisconsin, Jan Udy at Georgia Tech, and we have large subcontracting relationships with research projects that are part of the center at Madison and Georgia Tech, and Elizabeth Corley at ASU. At ASU we have 3 associate directors, and I'll sort of describe their roles a little bit later via the kinds of work that anticipatory governance supports, but there are Jamie Wetmore, Cynthia Celine, and Eric Fisher, and Ira Bennett is our assistant director for education. The project or the center is divided up into a set of research projects that are designed to operate in sort of a matrix-like organization. And so the 4 that you see here, what we call our real-time technology assessment programs, are, if you will, more methodologically oriented. And their organization draws on a paper that my co-director of the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, Dan Sarowitz, and I wrote about 12, 13 years ago, called Real-Time Technology Assessment. And what it did was it articulated a way of organizing mostly conventional methods in social sciences toward, as David said in the introduction, toward a more explicit way of expressing the values that we hold with respect to developing science and technology, and articulating that early on in the research process such that decisions that are made in laboratories might in fact reflect those values better and more explicitly. And so you can see, you've probably already read the titles of the 4 real-time technology assessment programs, and the folks who lead them, Jan Udy and Jose Lobo at ASU, Dietram Scheufele and Elizabeth Corley, Cynthia Celine and Kelly Rawlings, who used to be at ASU, is now at USC, Eric Fisher, and a repeat performance for Elizabeth Corley. And like I said, these are more sort of methodologically oriented activities, and they cross-cut with what we call our thematic research clusters, which are more substantively oriented activities around nano. So these are motivated by questions like, well, how is it that nano may contribute to goals, to social goals that we have in equity and equality? So early on in the visioning around nano, the UN mentioned the possibility of nanotechnology contributing to several of the Millennium Development Goals. And there's been a modest little research program that's been chugging along across the nano community trying to figure out whether in fact that has been the case. If it has been the case, how did it happen? If it hasn't been the case, why didn't it happen? And the work that Susan Cousins and Jamie Wetmore here are doing in the center is meant to pursue that avenue of research. Then we have this thing that we call urban design materials in the built environment, otherwise known as Nano in the City, led by Arnhem Wieck and Sander van der Leeuw. And a lot of the discussion about nano involves doing things that are lighter, smaller, cheaper. That that is one of the chief virtues of the kinds of materials that people might be able to design using nanotechnology. You've probably read in various places more recently about the ability now to make graphene, which is a single layer carbon molecule that can presumably go out forever, but it's actually really hard to make it at anything bigger than that. So a couple of guys got a Nobel Prize for their ability to make sheets of graphene. But how is it that nanotechnology, particularly in an urban context where sustainability issues are really quite key, most of humanity now, majority of humanity now live in urban environments, how is it that nano might in fact contribute to sustainable urban environments, and what are the kinds of decisions that need to go on to facilitate that? And so what we do through the center is we do, research along these lines where people are using these methods to do what they normally do, focused on nano. So Jan Udy and Jose Lobo and Phil Shapira and other people do bibliometric and patent analysis around nano, and oftentimes over the course of the center, it will be inflected by the kinds of concerns that other people have as we develop over the 10 years that we've been working together as a center. But then the data that they produce will then become grist for other kinds of work that the center is doing. So can we, for example, identify in the bibliometric and patent analysis things that might be indicators of the development of nano in, say, a more equitable or a more green fashion? For the moment, the short answer for the latter one is, despite all the hype and hope, green nano, not so much. But we can talk about that later. So this thing called anticipatory governance, as I mentioned, is really the central intellectual vision that we've been articulating to motivate the work of the center. And the brief definition is here: a broad-based capacity extended throughout society that can act on a variety of inputs to manage emerging knowledge-based technologies while such management is still possible. So if for folks who know the STS literature around this area, there is something that a scholar named David Collingridge put forth in 1980 that's known as the Collingridge dilemma, which basically says that if you try to act to design a new technology too late in the game, the interests are so tightly clustered around it that it really takes an enormous amount of effort, possibly too much effort than you can muster, to redesign that technology. But if you go upstream and try to act early, you have no idea what its consequences are in the world, and so you don't actually know what to act on. So this vision of anticipatory governance is not meant to be a sort of slicing of the Gordian knot, if you will. There's no, sort of techno-scientific solution to the Collingridge dilemma, but it's meant to provide ways of doing what we have to do anyway. That if we intend to do any kind of knowledge-based innovation, then there are things that should go along with it that will at least minimize the consequences of the Collingridge dilemma. What I want to point out here and spend a couple of slides dwelling on, as we go on in the next few, is this word anticipate or anticipation, and really give you a sense, try to convince you that what we're dealing with here is a different kind of thing than we normally talk about when we talk about foresight or the future or so forth. And just let me see, okay. So the word etymologically comes from this Latin prefix ante and this root capere, which literally means to take into possession beforehand. And it doesn't mean, it is not technically a synonym for all these other kinds of words that we have about foresight, about prediction, about prudence, and so forth. It has nothing to do, I want to convince you of this, if nothing else, that we need a word, and that word happens to be anticipation, for a disposition toward the future that has nothing to do with predicting the future as such, but has to do with the actions that we take now oriented toward a set of futures that may unfold. And that's what I want to argue anticipation is about. And how we sort of play that out in terms of a research agenda, I'll describe to you in a little bit. So, more concretely, what is this anticipatory governance about? Like I said, it's a strategic vision, and we've described it as a sort of composition of a set of capacities. And yes, I'm using this word foresight here, and I told you foresight wasn't the same, but foresight unfortunately happens to be the term of art for the set of future-oriented methodologies that we have. And so I didn't want to repeat the word anticipation. So foresight there. But the point is that all governance requires a disposition toward the future. Okay? There's nothing that you can do about making a governing decision now that is not about activities that happen after you make that decision. Everything you have is future. There's no governing the past, it's already done. There's no governing the present because that's where the decision lies in. So everything that is governance has some sort of disposition toward the future. And the trick is choosing the right disposition to apply to the things that you're talking about. So you could have a governing disposition with respect to the future, where the future is tomorrow and you're pretty sure the sun is going to rise, and a predictive mode is going to be okay when thinking about the sun rising tomorrow. What disposition should you use when you're talking about emerging technologies like nano, synthetic biology, geoengineering, maybe fracking? That's the question that we're trying to deal with. So all governance requires a disposition toward the future. That disposition that I want to get you to believe in is what we call anticipation. Second, processes of public engagement that are crucial normatively, strategically, and pragmatically. So what this means is, sort of from a normative perspective, I utterly buy into Langdon Winner's identification of technology with legislation. Both technology and legislation are forms of things through which ordinary people get to pursue the things that they find good in the world, that they want to do. And if you believe the argument that therefore people should have a say in the legislation that they live under, with, and through, then you should probably believe that people should have a say in the technologies that they live under, with, and through. So that's the normative point about public engagement. The strategic and pragmatic points are, of course, that if you are, say, a promoter of nanotechnology circa 2000, 2001, and you truly believe that nanotechnology is going to lead to the next industrial revolution and a major increase in human well-being across the planet, then you're not going to want it to suffer the fate that GM food at that time seemed to have suffered, and so you're going to want to engage the public beforehand rather than after the fact. Pragmatically, because we have learned that, users have things to say to producers in the development of new technologies. There is expertise out there that can actually make stuff better, both in terms of adding knowledge and adding experience and expertise. Third, again, a sort of very simple observation, scientists know things that the rest of us don't, and vice versa. So we have a knowledge integration problem where we want to be able to put social scientific knowledge, humanistic knowledge, next to and interact it with scientific and engineering knowledge. This is, the perspective is not quite that the challenge is or the problem is as stark as, say, C.P. Snow's Two Cultures, but that it is very difficult to put these kinds of knowledges in the same room, on the same table, at the same object at the same time. And then fourth, this horrible neologism that we've got that my NSF program officer doesn't want me to use in public, but you guys, you're here at Berkeley, this is not public. Ensembleization, which means that this stuff works a lot better together. And it actually comes from the literature, a piece that my ASU colleagues Ed Hackett and the late Dave Kahns wrote about the kinds of, the sets of research tools, the ensembles that are brought to bear on large, hairy problems like, say, making a nuclear fusion reactor. So yeah, this is fusion research. So you can imagine, for example, that you get the best kind of foresight or anticipation if you can manage to bring users and producers together and people with social expertise and technical expertise together. And that's basically what that means in that context. The governance side of anticipatory governance. If you go back to the beginnings of nano, and you can see it in the beginnings of genetic engineering, you can see it in the beginnings of synbio, you can see it in the beginnings of geoengineering, you often get caught in this stark dichotomy between doing something or banning something, or perhaps the slightly softer version of a moratorium rather than an outright ban. And so on the do side, of course, there's the determinist perspective from the World's Fair in 1933. Science finds, genius invents, industry applies, man adapts. Okay, now, presumably we have a little bit more of a role than that. At least men do. I don't know what women are supposed to do. And then on the other side, we've got the moratoriums that are proposed by folks like the ETC group and Friends of the Earth and so forth, which in my view are problematic because in some sense generate the knowledge that you might need, that you might want to know out of the moratorium in a way. There's something quixotic about foregoing the creation of knowledge about something that you don't yet know. And so when these topics emerge on the public stage, we often get caught between these two visions of governance. One is stop it, the other is it's inevitable. And the point that I really want to make through anticipatory governance is that there actually are a wide array of governing mechanisms that we have, and that we really need to talk as early as possible about these different kinds of things. The ones that I have highlighted in red are the kinds of mechanisms that my center has focused on, other centers have focused on, and other researchers have focused particularly on other ones. And you can see regulation is not highlighted in red, but we can talk about why. Because one of the things that the center really has done is focused a lot of attention on the decisions that go on in science and engineering research laboratories, and tried to encourage scientists and engineers who are in their laboratories to understand that they too are decision makers, that they are part of the governance process. And by way of reflexivity, we would have to acknowledge that we're part of the governance process as well. And we can talk about how we try to deal with that problem, but I won't get reflexive in the middle of the talk on that issue. So there are, this host of governing mechanisms. We would not have, nuclear reactors if it were not for processes of indemnification. We, the story that, the retort that people often make who are not as familiar or accepting of this kind of work sometimes say, well, what would, would you have stopped the creation of the automobile? Okay, if you had known that it was going to kill 40,000 people a year every year from the 1920s to the 1980s. We're in the 30,000s now, so it doesn't matter. And well, you might say, well, maybe not. And contribute to global warming, by the way. You might say maybe not, but maybe we would have done something a little differently about how we would have organized or designed the automobile and the systems around it had we had real sit down to talk about it. But we didn't have a real sit down to talk about it, and we want to do that with technologies that we still have some manner of opportunity to engage with. So this anticipatory governance idea is not a new idea, it's really just a new capacity. This guy on the left here is Detlev Bronk, who might be known to some of you. He was a mid-century interdisciplinary scientist. He was one of the founders of biophysics, and became president of Johns Hopkins University, of the National Academy of Sciences, of Rockefeller University, as elite a natural scientist in mid-century, as there was, perhaps short of winning. And this quotation that's up here is derived from testimony in favor of including the social sciences in the original proposal for a national science. And in giving this testimony in favor of social science, he broke from the ranks of his other elite natural scientists and engineers in welcoming the social sciences. Folks like Vannevar Bush and so on were not interested in bringing the social sciences into the National Science Foundation because they believed, if not that they actually were intellectually tainted by strange ideology, that the people in Congress believed that social sciences were that way. And so they didn't want to threaten an engineering enterprise would create by inclusion of sciences. Bronk was somebody who believed otherwise. Now this is entirely an instrumental role for the social sciences, but again in context something entirely different from what his colleagues were saying. On the anticipatory side, of course, this is some intellectual derivation from the ideas that Alvin Toffler discussed in Future Shock. Has anybody actually ever read Future Shock? Here, it's amazing. Whatever you think of Toffler, whatever you think of the fact that he was an academic sociologist who, millions in print, was really the most important thing that people said of. Has a logic that is not different from most of what we do today. That scientific and technical change is increasingly rapid, that the rapidity of its change is alienating to a whole lot of people, and that we have to design new sets of institutions and new social structures to deal with that alienation. So Future Shock was what he labeled that alienation, and his prescription for dealing with it was this thing that he called anticipatory democracy, which was essentially joining New England town hall style democracy with long-term planning. And he sort of saw this long-term plan somewhat more technical than I do, where it involved things like being able to run economic models of your budget out 20 years in the future, so you could actually have a sense of what things might be like 20 years in the future, rather than any, say, more participatory scenario development kinds of perspectives. But this is fundamentally the kind of thing that Toffler was engaged in. So what happened in the context of the Nano Center is, and this is I guess a nod to the positive aspects of the accountability requirements of public support. The Center for Nano and Society is part of NSF's portfolio in a nationwide nanotechnology initiative, the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which is sort of in sequence after the Human Genome Initiative, after the Climate Initiative, and perhaps there was something before that, which are high-level initiatives articulated by the President and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, adding not necessarily any new money to the R&D system, but providing substantial rewards for agencies to focus their work on these particular areas. So in the development of the National Technology Initiative, the powers that be articulated a set of strategic goals, one of which, the four, was the responsible development of nanotechnology. Basically, what fell under the NSF and the NNI's vision of responsible development was, being able to do things in an environmentally safe way, developing products that were explicitly environmentally benign or that might help with environmental remediation. Oh, and by the way, maybe some of these ethical, legal, and social things had a heavy inflection on the environment. But we were called on as being part of this initiative, and in the RFP that we responded to basically help this responsible development And so what we're doing in this vision of anticipatory governance is in some sense trying to reconfigure this idea of responsible development to make it doable through an NSF Research Center. And summarizing what I've said, basically what we've tried to do is a temporal move of anticipation. What is it that we can do now with a disposition toward the future that sees the future as open and manipulable to some extent, and a jurisdictional move that sees the laboratory as a site of governance and not simply legislatures or regulatory agencies or corporate boardrooms as places of governance. So, why would we want something like this? Why would we want a capacity for anticipatory governance? And underlying this, as you'll see, is a sort of critique of the risk paradigm and its cognates in science policy and other areas of science decision making. We would want a capacity to do this because first, we cannot engage in prediction. We don't have that capacity. So, maybe you believe that we're going to get it at some point. Believe that the technology that NSF and EPA have funded at Duke and at UCLA and UC Santa Barbara that are doing predictive toxicology are going to come up with a way to look at a molecule and tell you that it's going to be good or bad in the environment or in any particular biological system. Until we get that, we need something else. We need a stopgap. A fail-safe, well, research projects, and we're not in the business of forecasting the conclusion of research projects, maybe they won't get there. So if we don't get prediction, what do we have? Priority setting. A capacity to predict may not be comprehensive and doesn't necessarily tell us how to deploy that capacity. Okay, so maybe we'll have some predictive capacity in nanotoxicology, but only with respect to carbon nanotubes and buckyballs, and not with respect to the heavy metal things that go into quantum dots and things that are used in diagnostics. Who knows? And then generality, prediction in some areas. Nano doesn't imply prediction. Emerging technology is synthetic biology. So unless you can say that we have and are going to have a predictive mode that will operate across platforms, then we need some other kind of capacity to work on this. And I view the risk paradigm as just a shade different than a predictive paradigm, where instead of viewing a future that you're supposed to identify and one-to-one, the risk paradigm merely separates that into a couple of different futures. One's 40, one's 30, the other's 30. So we rather than one to map onto. We can talk a little bit about that in discussion as well. But what I also want to say is, fifth, do we actually want prediction? Prediction has a bad rap classically. So, the oracle at Delphi predicted perfectly well, except people in their self-centeredness were incapable of understanding what the prediction actually said and went about systematically misinterpreting it based on their own interests. The seer Tiresias, who was instrumental in the Oedipus myth, of course, creates the prophecies that are that are self-fulfilling. They start off the chain of the prophecy starts off the chain of events that ends up in its fulfillment. And Cassandra, the prophetess in the city of Troy, was blessed with perfect foresight and cursed with perfect disbelief by her listeners, and so warned the Trojans against taking the horse in. And we all know what follows. So you can, map your favorite contemporary scientific controversies onto these different modes of failure, of foresight, if you like, or prediction. But even when we have prediction in hand, it still has modes of failure. In another version of the talk, I follow that up with a slide. Who here has read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy? Okay, so there's a Foresight technology it's a social technology in the Foundation trilogy called psychohistory, where in the setting of the series of novels, humanity has grown to such numbers, the trillions upon trillions across the galaxy, that one could devise a true statistical predictive social science of human behavior and social outcomes. And it quite seems to me that a lot of the stuff around crowdsourcing and futures markets and so forth deserves this kind of Asimovian analysis about what is it actually trying to do and whether it's a predictive mode that we in fact want to rely on. So it's a sort of discussion of this set of warrants